Good afternoon. Hi, hello to everyone. Welcome to our second conversatorio around the question of Afro-Latin American studies and the institutionalization of the field. My name is Sherwin Bryant, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies here and affiliated faculty with Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And this ongoing series is sponsored by the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Northwestern University, as well as the Department of African American Studies. It has also been sort of co-curated with the Andean Cultures and Histories working group with my colleague, Jorge Coronado, as well as a range of colleagues in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. We want to give a special thank you before we get started to Danny Postel for all of his work behind the scenes, as well as Cindy Pingree. So a warm welcome to everyone. A special thanks to Danny and Cindy, and a very special thanks to all of our invited guests, who I would like to now introduce. Today we're in for a real treat of a conversation about a very vibrant field that is overlapping with a number of interdisciplinary endeavors in the humanistic studies in the academy. Those of you who are a part of our audience know this, no doubt better than many of us here today. And so we thank you for coming and joining us and being a part of this conversation. Today, we're going to be treated to a dialogue with colleagues, Professor Jorge Reid-Andrews, Professor Michele Reid-Vazquez, and Professor Edmund T. Gordon. And Professor Jorge Reid-Andrews is a historian of Afro-Latin America, of Latin American history, has published numerous books, monographs, as well as a range of articles. And I would say is no doubt one of the leaders in the field. You know, currently he's working on a series of projects, including a translation in collaboration with Paulina Alberto of the University of Michigan of a series of articles from the Afro-Latin American press, and a revised second edition of his important synthesis, Afro-Latin America, 1800 to 2000. Right? He is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of History there. Professor Edmund T. Gordon is an anthropologist whose work has focused on power and social transformation in the Black diaspora. He's the founding chair of the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies from 2010 to 2017 at the University of Texas at Austin, and is currently the vice provost for diversity at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Michele Reid-Vazquez is in the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh and is a historian of the Caribbean. Her first book, The Year of the Lash, looks at free people of color in Cuba during the 19th century Atlantic world. And her ongoing projects look at the circulation of free Blacks in the Caribbean, as well as her work institutionally to think through the intersections of Afro-Latin American studies and Afro-Latino studies, or Afro-Latinx studies. So we're looking forward to a very vibrant conversation with them. I want to also introduce Kristina Lee, who is a PhD student here in the Department of Sociology, working on questions of race, mestizaje, and nation, especially in the countries of Mexico and Peru, in the context of internationalist calls for concerns around the lives of Afrodescendientes. So we're going to moderate this together, Professor Jorge Coronado, myself, and Kristina Lee. And we want to just sort of go ahead and start this conversation and ask our panelists to perhaps start with a kind of early question that we have which is what factors do you see contributing to the growing institutionalization of Afro-Latin American studies? That institutionalization, I have in mind the institutionalization in the American Academy, but also in the academy outside of the United States. Any of our panelists can answer this question.
We are playing chicken. We're waiting to see who goes first.
Well, I mean, I can start. First, I just want to thank Jorge and Sherwin for inviting me to be part of this important conversation, especially with scholars whose work that I admire, honestly. But I would say a lot of it has to do with the maturity of the discipline, of the field, of the demand from both undergraduate and graduate students which administrations are finally, listening, but also there's been people have been working hard. I mean, I just think of Ted Gordon's work to establish a Department of Africana Studies or African Diaspora Studies. So all of that work has kind of come in many instances, not all instances, but in many instances have come into their maturity, and that there are scholars, multiple scholars, senior and newly minted, who are actively engaged in this field, and also making tremendous engagement with the scholars in Latin America who do this work as well. So I think it's a particularly important moment in which these things are kind of coalescing around the institutionalization of them. It's not complete, because trust me, we're still trying to get things done over here at Pitt and other places. But in some cases, there are a lot of good examples about this, with this happening.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also agree with Michelle's thanking you all for inviting us to be with you today. I'm seeing a number of faces out there that I know, and some names that I know, and it's great to see those folks and folks that I don't know as well. Michelle's absolutely right. There are more and more people who are working in this area. And of course, as you get more people coming into a field, they want to talk to each other. They want to make connections. They want to set up webs of relationships. They want to hold events and so on. And that's the upside, that's the positive side of institutionalization. I think there are two downsides of institutionalization, which are unavoidable. We're going to embrace them and accept them as part of the deal. One is that universities are themselves institutions, and they are comprised of many smaller institutions, the programs and the departments, that kind of compete with each other for resources from those large structures. And in order to engage in that competition, you yourself have to institutionalize. You have to take on programmatic form or departmental form or whatever it might be. And I have to say, having spent now 40 years in the academy, I am not a total fan of that process of institutionalization, but I accept it as the price that one pays in order to do this work that we want to do. But that's one downside. The other downside is that as fields institutionalize, and come on, don't we all feel this, orthodoxies get established, and it becomes harder to do new, different, creative, innovative things. And this whole field is one gigantic innovation that's been going on since, I would argue, probably the 1980s and picking up speed in the 1990s, early 2000s. And that's been a tremendous process to be part of. As we become more institutionalized, I mean, good luck to us. I hope that we can maintain that spirit of innovation, that spirit of creativity, of doing super interesting things. But institutions, you know, they're not altogether set up to that. Their strong point is not to promote innovation. It's rather to keep doing things in the way that they have been done. Nevertheless, let's be optimistic. I think we'll be up to the challenge. And what are the options? So that we have to go that route.
A slightly different perspective, being probably in a different part of the country, and also having my work outside the US be in a different portion of the world than many who are doing Afro-Latino studies. So first of all, I think one of the reasons why Afro-Latino studies is becoming more institutionalized, particularly in Black studies kind of departments and settings, is a response to the accusations of essentialism that come from critical theory. And I think we see Black studies units and departments at kind of the most prestigious institutions moving into the direction of embracing diaspora or Afro-Latino studies as a means of trying to emphasize the kind of diversity of Blackness and to avoid the accusation of Afro-essentialism or Afrocentric essentialism, et cetera. So I think that's one of the things that's gone on. I also think that in places where there are Afro-Latino populations in the United States, then you see a proliferation of Afro-Latino studies, the East Coast, maybe Chicago, where you're all at, et cetera. In other places like the Southwest and the West, where Latino populations are less likely to think about themselves as having Afro-Latino components, I think we're still, there's less interest and less emphasis on Afro-Latino studies. And then beyond that, outside the United States, in as much as Latin American, Central American, and Hispano, well, actually in the Caribbean in general, in as much as Black studies is not a discipline, then having Afro-Latino studies doesn't get to be really have a disciplinary status either. So in a place like Brazil, which has an enormous Black population, there's very few Black studies programs. And so therefore Afro-Latino studies is not really, part of the deal. In Central America, again, where Black studies is not part of what's considered to be the general curriculum of higher education, Afro-Latino studies doesn't really exist in that sense. So that would be my response to this.
If I may, I'd like to follow up on that with a question I think is related. I'm interested in hearing how you all would think about the antecedents, right? I think in what each of you said, there's a way of thinking about the ways in which Afro-Latino studies as a field is thinking about a kind of long history of thinking about race. I'm thinking within Latin America, especially. I can think of intellectuals like Freire, like Fernando Ortiz, like Mariátegui, like Vasconcelos, right, who are thinking kind of from really different ideological positions about race. And I'm assuming, and perhaps that's not right, that Afro-Latino studies has some sort of take on these previous, sometimes institutionalized, in the case of Vasconcelos, for example, ways of conceiving, right, of Black subjects and well, indigenous subjects, right, in Latin America. So how would you think about the points of continuity and discontinuity with that edifice that is thinking about race in Latin America?
I think that's a great and very powerful question. Those thinkers in the early 1900s, very beginning of the 1900s, are really, in some ways, kind of the founding fathers of Afro-Latin American studies, even though very few people do their work today in the same way that those folks do or have the same ideas that those folks do. They were reacting against an ideological situation in which they grew up, which was a situation ruled by scientific racism. It was a system that insisted that individuals and that nations were completely defined by their racial heritage, that everybody had a racial inheritance. It was a biological inheritance. It determined who you were, it determined who everybody was, it determined who nations were. And these guys were in some ways some of the original anti-racists. They were reacting very strongly against that system and trying to argue that if the part that they couldn't get away from was that race was terribly important. They continued to buy that. They totally accepted that, and to a certain degree accepted as well the idea that it was biologically inherited. But then they went on to insist that it didn't determine the destiny of individuals and societies and nations in the way that the scientific racists argue. We look back at them today and we reject the racist, the essentialist parts of their thinking. But at the same time, we got to acknowledge that they were trying to argue against a situation which was deeply unsatisfactory. They sent things on a very different direction. And with a few more stops along the way, a few more empirical and ideological and intellectual stages along the way, that process of contestation and arguing and researching and so on brought us to the field that we occupy today. Now, Jorge, you started out by asking, what does Afro-Latin America studies today make of those guys? And the answer is, there are a lot of people who do Afro-Latin American studies, and there are a lot of different takes on those intellectuals, I would argue. And we could go further and go deeper with that if you want to, but I'll stop there for the moment.
If anybody else has something on that, great. If not, no worries. There's plenty of questions.
Yeah, because that's why I stopped, so somebody else could say something.
I'm happy to offer up another question as well. So in your responses, we've heard you all kind of connect like the histories that intellectuals like Vasconcelos and Ferry have had, the impact that these scholars have had in their respective countries and throughout the region, right? And so I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit about how intellectuals like that, which we know have kind of influenced the way that we think of Afro-Latin American studies, especially in the United States, but how they've influenced the way that Afro-Latin American studies of Afro-descendants have been taken up in their respective countries, in different countries throughout Latin America, and how you've seen that reflected throughout your work studying different countries in Latin America.
Well, I can get things going a little bit, I suppose, by going back to the previous questions. So, what's Afro-Latino studies take on these gentlemen, which is what they are? And, I take Reid Andrews' point that they were anti-racist in their own way and certainly operating from the context of their times. And I appreciate that, but I think in general, I use them as a foil in some sense, and in terms of trying to think through, particularly what's the place of Blackness within Latin American nations, and and the whole issue of mestizaje, and the complete, in many cases, erasure of Blackness, not to say denigration. Well, now I've forgotten the second question, but to go back to the first one, I think they've been tremendously productive, but they've been productive in some sense, in the negative sense. They've given at least me and my work a foil to move off of, and a way to think about the difference of Blackness, how Blackness relates and doesn't relate to kind of national identities and nationhood, and also a way to think through, which is very important in my work and for a lot of people in Central America, and I guess elsewhere, the difference between the positionality of Afro-descended people or Black people and Indigenous people, because that's a it's an important issue, it's an important question, and the ways in which indigeneity and Blackness relate to nation and mestizaje has been tremendously productive, I think, for Afro-Latino studies. So they set that up in some sense, but more as a foil than anything else.
No, and I would echo a lot of what's already been said. Just thinking about the way those conceptualizations of the nation, and the way that who gets included and who gets excluded, and I often, when I teach about it, it's like this is the framework that they want to use. It's it says it's anti-Black. It might say it's not anti-Black, but it clearly is, because of all the exceptions that are to the rules that they're trying to use. And so so I often use it as a jumping off point to say these are not good examples, even though there's an effort to acknowledge Blackness, it's in such a way that really, I think some of you all mentioned it, renders people invisible. And so that's often a place I start with conceptually to help kind of move my students along the road of the different kinds of works that come along to embrace and uplift and render more visible these populations, because they're in many instances large populations that experience this kind of erasure.
You know, Jorge, could we push a little further with this?
Absolutely.
And I think the best way maybe to respond to this is probably to work country by country and to look at the intellectuals who were really foundational in kicking off these debates and these conversations. And if we were to start with Brazil, Freire would be that person. He was not the only one, but he was certainly the one who has been most salient over the years. And it's really easy for us 100 years later to point at all the things that he got wrong. But since we need to have a full appreciation of all the work that any intellectual does, I'm going to propose that we spend at least a moment or two thinking about what he got right. And it's kind of back to the same points that Ted and Michele were saying, that Blackness had been to a large degree rendered invisible in the nation in the 1800s, early 1900s. And Gilberto Freire came along and said, hold on a minute, Blackness, enslavement, the experience of plantation agriculture, and African culture and African cultural forms are absolutely central to who we are as Brazilians. He's saying this in the 1930s, still at the high watermark of scientific racism. Now, scientific racism had feared that Blackness was central to being Brazilian and that it meant that Brazil was doomed as a society and as a nation. And Freire says, no, to the contrary, look at all the positive contributions made by people of African ancestry, and then further amplified by the process of race mixture that takes place in the setting of the plantation and the sugar society that grew up around the plantations. We've got to walk away from scientific racism. We've got to reject that very negative image of that whole process and instead really look hard through the kind of in-depth research that he was trying to do, research not in ways that we would do it today, but really taking seriously that plantation experience and how it had been lived by all the people who took part in it. Now, his assertions about that experience turned out over the long haul to be so problematic that he has given employment, I would argue, to hundreds of historians and anthropologists in the years since who are trying to get the story right and trying to get it corrected and trying to get a different kind of history written. But he and the people who were working with him really kicked off those debates in the 1920s and 1930s. And folks, a moment of humility here, right? It's very easy for us to spot what he got wrong. I guarantee you, and of course, I'm not going to be around to test this hypothesis, but I guarantee you that if there are still universities 100 years from now, they're going to look back at us and they're going to say, wow, boy, those folks, oh, big problems. And of course, they'll be right. And we can't imagine what the problems are that they are going to identify in our work, but for sure they will. So, okay.
Not only that, but unlike our precursors, they're going to have recordings of us.
So that sort of saying that people are products of their time and that we need to sort of see what positive work they provided and all that, I'm willing to take that a short distance. One of the problems that I have with a lot of these folks is that they are not just the folks who are kind of foundational in terms of thinking about Blackness in Latin America or Afro-Latinidad. They're also the folks who are foundational for Latin American studies in particular, and for the particular place, the marginal place of Blackness in Latin American studies. So, I won't speak for Michele, but what I heard her saying was, all right, she starts there, and then she moves off of there. And that's the way I prefer to do it as well, because part of the critique of these folks is making the critique of present day Latin American studies and the residue of that thinking that continues to exist and institutionalized in Latin American studies.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I want to kind of ask a follow-up question. And there's actually a question that I saw pop up in the chat, and we will have an opportunity for broader Q&A later on. And I should also say that we are recording. Thank you for reminding me of that, Jorge. I apologize for not saying that to everybody beforehand, but we are recording. The question that I want to ask is, to what extent are these fields accountable to, in dialogue with, anything that we want to call Black history, Black historiography, or Black political thought, right? And that could be coming out of the US Academy, or we also could situate it coming out of the academies more globally, Latin America and the Caribbean and beyond. How has Black history, for example, in terms of the historians on the panel, interfaced with yours, or how has a kind of critical Black ethnography, anthropological approaches for Professor Gordon interacted with yours? How do you see these kinds of dialogues playing out in the field, as it were? Anybody can start us off.
Michele, go.
No, I mean, I had, well, I have I guess a couple of angles which I take. Some of it, part of it is often Black history is set up to be separate and distinct from Latin American history. And so the African diaspora component is often left out of it. But then I think about individuals like Arturo Schomburg, who was from the early 19th century, talking about these African diasporic connections and the interlinked histories. And so it's complicated. There again, I think about the political, what's the word I'm trying to think of? The political thrust on the US side to have people of African descent recognized as citizens with complete civil rights. But I think the missing element that I kept seeing for Latin America is that they're doing the same thing. And so there needs to be greater incorporation kind of between the two spheres as opposed to these separate kinds of spheres. So there's a lot more work I've seen certainly in the past 15 years being in the field where we see much more of that kind of activity, but it's still, I still find it fairly separate. I mean, I'm fortunate to be in Africana studies where it's much more obvious and recognized, but sometimes you do have to remind people that the diaspora is much larger outside of the US, and we need to make sure that we talk about that it's not, again, don't be surprised. Everyone's always surprised when I say, 160, 170 million Black people in Latin America and the Caribbean, as to the 45 million or so here in the US. So looking at that Black history piece, there are multiple angles to it that still, I think they have a lot of reconciling to do.
Yeah, to me, Sherwin, Black history in Latin America is Black history. The end. Black history in every country, Black history in England, Black history in the United States, Black history in France, wherever it might be. All of those histories are the story of people of African ancestry in their specific national context. And then, of course, increasingly fields of transnational Black history as well, and the context across borders and connections across borders and so on. All of these are different national and international manifestations of one large field, which is Black history. Now, by the same token, Black history in the United States has historically been a big enough topic and a big enough project, and one that's been hard to carry out and hard to realize, that people who concentrate on Black history in the United States, it's very easy for them to not pay attention to the Black history being done in other countries. Oh my God, how could we forget Africa, which of course is the Black history, but again, in a very different cultural setting, very different national settings. Hold on, I was going someplace really great with this, but I can't remember where I'm going. Oh, just that the development of Black history in the United States is, for me, part of a big global field of Black history just as historians of the United States don't pay much attention to the history of Latin America, I mean, it's true, we have to acknowledge it. Black historians of the United States may not have paid a great deal of history over time to Black history in Latin America. Folks, I have to say, probably the reason I got into this field was when I started writing and giving talks on Black history in Latin America, the main people who were interested in hearing about that were people who were interested in Black history in the United States. And they were saying, holy cow, this is important. I didn't know about this. I need to learn more about it. And that kind of gave me the incentive to keep working on Black history in Latin America. And I think everybody recognizes the connections and the kinships there, the people doing work in Latin America, and the people doing work in the United States, and the people doing work, as manifested by, talk about institutionalization, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, ASWAD, created in the late 90s, I believe, with the specific purpose of getting together all those people doing the history, doing Black history and culture all across the globe. And that's a very vital and important organization now. So Afro-Latin American history is Black history, period, in one part of the world.
So in my work, which is mostly in Central America, there are a number of Black historians, social scientists, other folks, ethnographers, all of whom are interested in race, really critical race work, who have been important. Some of them are no longer with us. And so, you know, it's Trevor Purcell and Barrow in Panama, and Quince Duncan and Senor in Costa Rica, and Palacio in Belize. And so there's actually, given the level of higher education in Central America, it's really amazing how many Black scholars have been doing this work over the last 40 or 50 years, although it's still a limited group for precisely those reasons. So that's been important. What's really been interesting to me, however, is the other side of that coin, and that's the reception of US Black scholars in Latin America and elsewhere. Where my experience has been is that our reception amongst Black people and other Black scholars in those places has been pretty good, but we've generally been panned by many others, particularly Anglo or white scholars from elsewhere, Europe and United States and all that, for exporting a American-centric kind of perspective of race to these kinds of places. So, you know, there's the famous Hanchard, accusations in Brazil and et cetera, et cetera. I think the phenomenon is really, really very interesting. That on the one hand, there's collaboration amongst scholars of African descent across national borders in ways which are really, I think, important and have been stimulating on all sides. And on the other hand, we can get pretty heavily critiqued for supposedly our Afro-American imperialism, intellectual imperialism. I see Sherwin smiling.
Well, sure. I mean, what do we make of this sort of charge, right? What this charge of importing sort of US-centric notions? I mean, it's you draw a kind of interesting juxtaposition between Afro-descendant scholars resonating and collaborating on the one hand, and other scholars who you describe as white scholars mounting this kind of critique. I mean, is there any there in terms of so-called U.S. notions of race being imported? Is that something that we should concern ourselves with as we kind of push this field along in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead. No, I was just thinking about I work primarily in Cuba, and it is very difficult to kind of not necessarily to talk about the African diasporic history, but to talk about race. And in the U.S., those are intertwined, almost interchangeable. But in Cuba, it's a very different prospect. You know, although I know that there are scholars there trying to do more work identifying, for example, various forms of racism within the Cuban construct. It's still an area where it's very difficult to talk about, and they do talk about it in terms of, oh, that's the way you all think about it in the U.S. We don't have that here. Todos somos cubanos. You know, we don't have to. We're not worried about that. And yet, it's pretty obvious when I talk to my colleagues who are Afro-Cuban, just exactly the same kinds of things that happen, inequalities that happen there happen here. And so I'm like, well, what do you call them there? Like I'm always trying to figure out, like, what is it? How are people naming these kinds of elements if these are not the names that we're using in the U.S.? How would they do it in their context? I haven't gotten any answers on that end, but it's more about navigating the politics of race there, navigating how Afro-Latinidad is expressed there. Again, they're happy to talk about the historical roots of it. That's not the issue. It's more about race is not, the conception of race is different from ours. And so those have been pieces that have been harder, I think, kind of the harder piece to make the connection to. People, we're all looking at the same thing and seeing the same thing, but calling it something else, and it's refracted differently. So that's been the part that I've seen in terms of don't bring that U.S. ideological piece down here when that's not what's happening. And I look around and say, well, let me tell you what I see, and you tell me, you know, what it is. Like, how would you describe this? If this is not inequality or if this is not racism, then I'm all open to hear about kind of how those configurations are presented.
That's such a fascinating comment, Michele. To me, you know, just kind of personally, right, in part because it reflects so much of stuff that I've seen working in, you know, representations of indigeneity in a very different discipline. There are very similar, I think, attitudes towards both very different ways of speaking about race and, you know, the North-South, right, opposition and all the baggage, right, that's there in that dynamic. I wanted to kind of go just a little, we've been talking a lot about origins and different ways in which we can conceptualize, you know, the field's origins. I wanted to ask a question that refers back to this 1980s date that I think Reid Andrews put out there. You know, I think since the 1980s, right, and I'm glad to hear different dates on this, right, there's been this development of the field, right, and to my mind, that overlaps with, you know, different sorts of land and other rights that marginalized groups, right, that Black and other marginalized subjects have claimed, right, and have acquired through different processes, often constitutional processes, right, in Latin America. So how do you see that relationship, right? A way that question I think also might be framed is simply, how do we think about the relationship of Afro-Latin American studies to activism, right, on the ground in Latin America? So I think either way you'd like to respond to that, or whatever way you'd like to enter into the topic.
I see the relationship as being like that. It's not at all coincidental that this field really starts to move at precisely the same time that there's a real resurgence of racially defined Black mobilization and Indigenous mobilization as well in the 1970s, 1980s into the late 1900s. Those movements, one of the things that those movements are demanding, besides material goods like land, is, back to that question that we're always wrestling with, recognition of non-white racial groups in the nation, which means history, culture, and research to demonstrate that role, right? So that those movements, among the various demands that they made, were demands for more research on Black and Indigenous history and Black and Indigenous current realities. And of course, Latin American universities didn't drop everything immediately and start saying, yeah, we got to get to work on that. But selected individuals here and there did. And those individuals tended to become connected to various activist organizations. And as those organizations demand, for example, for more Black representation in universities had its effects, and more Black graduate students started entering history, the humanities, and other subjects and forming themselves as professors, many of them went on to become researchers whose work further added to Afro-Latin American history and to Indigenous history and studies as well. And then meanwhile, there's the point that we were just talking about. Those debates over whether US visions of race have any place in Latin America. And there for sure there was a history of those flows, those transnational intellectual flows going both ways. Afro-Latin Americans looking at the US and saying, terrible during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, then more interesting in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and by the 80s and 90s saying, geez, I wonder, we do wonder if the models of racial thought that people are developing up there might possibly be applicable to us. Meanwhile, North American intellectuals going to Latin America, having these dialogues with people there. Folks, my feeling is that all those dialogues can only be for the good. You're going to battle things out intellectually, including with people who in Latin America who totally reject them, who say, no, these North American ways of thinking have no application at all to our society. You've read what's been going on in France recently. Macron and other people speaking out against American racial thinking, contaminating the French Academy. These debates are really, really positive because they get everybody thinking about these issues, debating them, researching them, et cetera, and gradually kind of battling their way through to new understandings of what race means in these different societies. And if I can just make one concrete reference to an academic product that I found so kind of inspiring as an example of where those debates can lead, it would be that volume that I know a number of you have read, the Pigmentocracies volume that Ed Tellis coordinated and published in 2014. And you may remember that while he's the director of that project, the goal of which is to measure levels of racial inequality and discrimination and ideas about race and so on in 4 Latin American countries, the actual research and writing is being done by teams of scholars in each country who are taking North American tools of analysis, applying them to their societies, and telling us what the results are of using those tools. And then we, of course, as readers can decide what we make of those results. But the work that they did really, for me, pushed the boundaries in very important ways of our understanding of how race functions in 4 Latin American countries. And it could never have happened without that intellectual exchange, further pushed forward by Black movements, both in Latin America and in the United States. They're really, folks, the growth of these fields and the growth of those movements is absolutely, it's perfectly symbiotic. They're working, not to say that they're working conflict-free, not at all, but they're working totally in a kind of synergistic process, which really drives things for me over the last 40 years.
Thank you. Michele Reid-Vazquez, Edmund Gordon, anybody want to pick up on that?
No, I mean, I think Reid really said it all in terms of the ongoing, the collaborative, the kind of activist scholar piece of it. I don't think they would have propelled. The field would not have been propelled without the combined efforts of these groups. So I'm just thinking especially about the decentering of the myth of racial democracy, there's all the work that was put in motion to deconstruct that. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Reid with all those points.
And I'll agree as well, and just point out that during the 80s, one of the key things that was going on throughout Latin America for Black and Indigenous folks was trying to find a place in the nation and be able to claim rights of cultural citizenship in those nations. And so the kind of work that both historians and anthropologists do is very valuable, because making a claim for nation-like status has to do with creating a history for oneself as a people, and creating a culture that is nurtured and produced by that history in relationship to territory. And so those nation-like aspirations were well fed by the kind of work that we do and others like us do. So fit right into the moment.
Thank you.
So we are gearing up to switch over to our audience Q&A, but before we do, I think I would be remiss as a graduate student in Afro-Latin American Studies if I did not ask you all about what it is to be kind of located at the intersections of these different disciplines and to make your career out of that. And so I wonder if you all could talk to us a little bit about what your experience has been kind of positioning yourself within the institution across different departments in different cases, and how you've navigated that.
Well, as a refusenik, the way I've navigated the problem of Blackness and activism in anthropology is to get the hell out. It's not a good combination of, or at least anthropologists don't seem to think that the discipline really has room for folks. It wasn't, so long ago that Herskovits told Sinclair Drake or refused his applications to the SSRC for funding to work in Africa because Sinclair Drake was Black, and we know that Blacks shouldn't be studying Blacks because that's not what anthropology does. So these kinds of disciplines, activism is also, the hallmark of Black studies. We're doing work in order to be able to work with and for Black communities. That's not what anthropology is supposed to do either. And so it's a very fraught relationship with, at least in my case, with the established discipline of which from which I got my training. And my response was to try to pull together a like-minded set of folks to create an intellectual community that could be semi-autonomous from all that, and produce the kind of work that we thought was important.
Well, I'll just say, I guess, given the work, the foundational work of Ted and Reid, I would say I've had a fairly, I won't say easy time of it, but I think for me, it was about recognizing the way that the academy is set up, and that I work at these intersections where some are more privileged than others. And so I'm trained as a historian, but have always forever done work on the African diaspora, particularly in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America. But because my work is in the Caribbean, that has often been the framework that's been difficult for me, because it is Latin American, but it is not, depending on who's framing and who's asking. And so it often gets Caribbean, often gets read as Anglophone. And so so I have to always I have to position myself as a Latin American who works in the Caribbean, and then the larger space of the African diaspora. And so then it's kind of, and I imagine this could be leading to looking for positions, but taking note of the trends and how things are going. When I was coming through, Atlantic history, Atlantic world studies was really it's really emerging. And so that's when I had to kind of think about, and when we begin to see lots of job placements, job ads for Atlantic studies. So I had to think about, because clearly, if you're working in the 19th century Caribbean, that's the Atlantic, but how do you you have to think about how that framing works, how you answer the questions about conceptualization and the diaspora and how all these pieces are working together. So I think it's, and again, even as I go into continue working into Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx studies, thinking about how those two fields are at different positions in their development, and how I'm interested in those conversations as well, and realizing that the scholars have not been talking so much together about those either. And so just trying to create the spaces for scholars and everyone who's interested in learning more about them. So that's my long-winded way of saying I've been really fortunate to have spaces where people have been saying, yes, you absolutely do this. It's important work. Do not let anyone tell you can't or that you shouldn't. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to have that kind of support. But I do see it. I do see, students, grad students will come to me and say, I'm not, this is my advisor's not being helpful with this, or that I don't see, not really sure what direction it's going. I think part of it is having those conversations with scholars in your university, but also outside, to get a better sense of how things are emerging in the field, because that's also a piece that I know we take a long time in the academy, but we also have to be mindful of things that are emergent. The things I'm just noticing now, all the new kinds of formulations of, I say Africana studies, but race and inequality kinds of positions. And so how do you situate yourself if you're looking for positions in cluster hires, et cetera? How do you position yourself to do that? So I think it's being very mindful of those different conversations, of those different categorizations that are emerging, but to continue to do the work. So that's really my best advice.
I hear what Ted is saying, and I hear what Michele is saying. I think Michele and I both had the good fortune to come up through history as a discipline, as opposed to anthropology or other disciplines. And my experience was very much like Michele's. I was always very encouraged to do this work. Black history has a long-established, well-established place in the discipline of history. Never any question about the validity of that work. I know that's not the case across the board in the social sciences and in the humanities. However, what I would say to you as a student is that I'm a big believer in the disciplines because each of them brings very powerful analytical tools to the table. And I feel I've learned so much from reading the anthropologists who work on Black culture in Latin America. I've learned so much from reading sociologists like Ed Tellis. I learned so much from reading that book by Tiana Pachel that I'm sure a number of you have read, Becoming Black Political Subjects in Colombia. She's taking the tools of political science and applying them to the study of Blackness in Latin America. Every discipline has its very powerful analytical apparatus that it brings to bear. And we may have hard times with the people in the discipline, but we can never, I don't think, walk away from or reject the intellectual tools of those disciplines. And then also, Kristina, there's the practical fact that most of the hiring takes place in disciplines, right? Because they control most of the positions. So all the more reason, I mean, when you get to Ted's stage in life, you may be able to walk away and say, I'm going to do my independent thing. But as you're first coming into the profession, I think you really have to come in as a strong member of your discipline, using it to do the kind of work you want to do and making the case for it within your discipline, but really mastering that discipline while at the same time being very open to what all the other disciplines are doing. Because this field of Afro-Latin American studies and the field of Africana studies, they're the products of those cross-disciplinary conversations where that's where the innovation and the creativity really takes place, when you get disciplines talking to each other in ways that they don't necessarily do within their departmental settings. They tend to do that more in the programmatic and cross-disciplinary settings. But anyway, you're rooted in a discipline. Don't walk away from that discipline. Get really good at it and get strong in it, and then go on to make your way.
I need to defend myself from the accusation of being old and reckless, and individualist. What I'm talking about is institutionalization of the kind of work that we do, and particularly the kind of work that marries rigorous interdisciplinary work with activism, with trying to change the world in one way or another. So I didn't walk away and become a hermit. We walked away and created the Department of African Diaspora Studies. And it has a real mission. It has an interdisciplinarity to it that welcomes the various kinds of approaches that Reid is ballyhooing, but also welcomes it as a supportive place for Black people and others who want to do work that's important and that can impact the world, particularly the world of Black folks. So, and our students get jobs. So, you know, I agree disciplinarity is good, and I don't hold anything against you all historians and your history work and all that kind of thing. But Black studies is not just a cop-out. It's a politicized intellectual project that has real validity to it.
So I love this. I love this last volley. This is really really rich, and I think that this is the kind of sort of volley that we're talking about, right? That generates this very moment, right? In this very dialogue. So we want to open this up to our audience now, and you're going to be. I think Danny's already announced that you're in a position now to unmute yourself. And I've got a little bit of a queue going here. So we're going to go to Ashley Agbasoga here, one of our PhD students in anthropology, with our first sort of audience question. Ash?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for this generative space. This question is for everyone, but especially Dr. Gordon, as someone who's trained in a home discipline of anthropology, but also trained in Black studies at Northwestern, and takes up Black and Indigenous studies more to orient myself towards the work that I do. I want to especially thank you for your comments. And my question kind of had already been answered in that last bit of talk. But what I noticed with my work in what is known as Mexico, there is now like a resurgence of like, say, I mean, I argue that it's always been kind of institutionalized, but I won't give all my secrets away. But there's like, with the rise of recognition, like the Mexican Senate's recognized Black folks in Mexico in 2019. They were included in the census for the first time in 2020, et cetera. There's also the shift in institutionalizing Blackness in the academy. And the folks that I work with on the ground, if you will, critique that, right? And I guess what I've been trying to get at or think about is, there has been a really rich intellectual history with Black and Indigenous organizers and activists throughout the hemisphere that actually I would seem to think, from what I've read the last 6 years of doing this, find more similarities in their experiences than what institutions say they have. And those folks who are in the institutions are mostly non-Black and non-Indigenous. And that is appearing in the institutionalization currently in Mexico where I work, particularly around UNAM, CSAS, INA, where they're working on establishing Afro-Latin American studies, right? So thinking hemispherically, I guess, I'm wondering if there's room for the critique that we've been discussing, particularly around mestizaje, which is pertinent and growing louder and louder and louder, although it's been here since the 40s, the 60s in Black Latin American reading. Is there room for critique in Latin American studies? Because we already have established that there's not, in this case, in anthropology, where mestizaje is still quite untouchable. Vasconcelos, Beltran, who studied under Herskovits in my department, still very untouchable, right? Or do we see more of a pivot towards Black studies, right? And Black studies kind of doing this work instead of other folks in, say, Black Latin American studies, et cetera, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking me, and now I'll move over to Reid's side of things. Of course, there's room for critique in all these disciplines. There's definitely room for critique in anthropology. There are many fabulous Black anthropologists and not Black anthropologists who are engaged in critical approaches and doing, Black queer theory, Black, feminist theory, Black, critical race studies, et cetera, from using ethnography and from the discipline, and remain in the discipline and are engaged in the struggle. So I was being a little bit polemic there in saying that you have to get out and all that. You don't. And I say the same thing about Latin American studies. Latin American studies needs people in there fighting this fight, and particularly needs the folks who are focused on Afro-descended communities and focused on indigenous communities to continue to struggle to come to understand the differences of those experiences, but also to be fertilized by each other in terms of thinking theoretically and otherwise about how those experiences, though different, interchange, and how it is that they all relate to nationalist projects in Latin America. So, so now I'm speaking out of the other side of my mouth. Yes, of course, there's space. It's not the question whether there's space. We need to make the space for those kinds of interventions in those disciplines. And again, there are many people who are doing that.
Can I follow up on that question just a little bit and to sort of hammer down or hone in on what it means for there to be space? In other words, if I could innovate that question a little bit, is there space in anthropology departments or in Latin American studies programs for these kinds of concerns to be sort of the driving intellectual preoccupation of that unit? Is that person, when there is a new sort of hire in that line, can we point in those disciplines, in those areas, that it happens that someone working on Afro-Latin America is in that quote unquote position, so to speak? Or am I getting a little too impolite?
That's a much better articulation of my question, actually. So thank you, Dr. Bryant.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I can speak from a certain kind of experience. And in this, I think one of the things that Reid said before is, let's take it space by space and place by place. But I can tell you, some of you may have heard that at the University of Texas, there was a very dynamic program, the African Diaspora Program in Anthropology, that existed for about 20 years and produced, I think we still think that we produced more Afro-Brazilian anthropologists than even any university in Brazil. Produced a lot of students. There was not space in anthropology. In fact, the demise of that program had to do with the quantity of space that it ended up taking, because it threatened not the viability. It was felt to threaten the traditional subdisciplinary areas in anthropology, and it was strangled because it got too powerful, big and powerful. And I've only got my own notion about this, but as soon as Blackness gets too powerful, Blackness gets snuffed. And I think that's what happened there. And now I don't know if that's necessarily the case everywhere. And I think that, it is possible to grow semi-autonomous areas of subdisciplinary interest and all that in any number of places. But academia is very political. and power and resources is, you know, are the basis of real important tussles and fights. And once you get an upstart that's occupying too much space in terms of power and resources, you know, another way to think about it is most disciplines see having more than one scholar in any subdisciplinary area of it. I'm sure in your history department in Pittsburgh, you know, you've got one, I don't know, medievalist and one, you know, who knows, modern Europeanist and et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that you have two of you folks who are doing, I'm not sure if you're in the same department, what it is, something that has to do with Latin America must be threatening to somebody. You know, these things, the way these disciplines operate makes it very difficult to have a critical mass of folks doing things that are, especially doing things that they don't see as being what's normally disciplinarily accepted.
Other comments from our panelists before we open up to other questions? Either way, please. We've got about 23 minutes left.
I guess I want to, because I'm in Africana studies, and so coming from history, as someone who went from history to Africana studies department, and kind of realigning my conceptual frameworks, the politics of it have become very, very stark. I would definitely say. I think I saw it. I didn't understand it as clearly, or it was bifurcated from the history department I was in. Maybe because of the size, it's hard to say. But I'm in a small-ish Africana studies program, and the one thing that's been important is one that the department was created, like many other ethnic studies programs, out of activism through student organizing, and so that's something that we honor. But we also recognize that push and pull of power to maintain this kind of department. Our department has shrunk. We were half the size we were, I think, in the 80s. So that's been an issue. But at the same time, we've added a lot of scholars who are doing inherently transnational kinds of work. So it's been again an interesting space and a very enlightening space for me. I mean, and having to often defend the discipline itself has been really very distinct from my work and from when I was strictly in history, where it was kind of there's an assumption, of course, history. You know, how can you not critique, but how can you what's there to discuss? What's the problem? Whereas Africana studies, as I learned the history of that particular struggle for the discipline, that's been, again, and Pitt is poised right now to create a new space to deal with kind of ethnic studies issues. And I mean, I can see the politics popping all off of all the walls. And so just trying to prepare myself for the battles that are going to come from that. But I'm committed to it because these are incredibly important conversations, important issues, the research, all of it. And I don't want to see any of it neglected. So I know I'm going to have some sleepless nights. I'm going to have to, Sherwin, you're going to have to call me and make sure I'm okay over here. But there's a lot that's, again, the conversations I think are really critical, but being mindful of how these positions, how Afro-Latin American studies, African diasporic studies, more broadly Africana studies, as a discipline has had to fight, tooth and nail for space in the academy.
Yeah, thank you for that. Other comments, questions, other questions from the audience?
Sherwin, I think you've got one from Oscar de la Torre.
Please, Oscar. How you doing?
Hi, greetings everybody. And thank you for this interesting talk and these considerations. I have two quick questions. The first one would be to the three panelists, if possible. Maybe all of you can give some insight, but really quick. What are the 2 or 3 countries in in Latin America, right, that have the most room for growth in Afro-Latin American studies, right? Those countries where you know there's significant numbers of Black people and you think there should be many more studies of their history and their politics and their anthropology coming out. And the second one is about, again, for the 3, maybe you could, you know, I don't want to occupy a lot of time, but maybe you could give us a few tips on recent work on Black and mixed race intellectuals and political leaders, past and present, that you think, recent works that you think we could use in classes, right? About Afro-Latin America, about the African diaspora, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you very much and greetings to everybody.
I'm ready to roll on this one. For the 3 countries, I'm only going to propose 2 because I'm really undecided on the third. But the 2 that for me are easy would be first Venezuela, major Black population, amazingly little attention to questions of race over time, and especially since independence. And the other would be the Dominican Republic, where there has been a good deal of research in recent years, but there can always be more. And this, I mean, every country's racial situation is unique, and we can't say something's really unique. It's either unique or not unique. But the situation in the Dominican Republic really is unique because of the relationship with Haiti and also the relationship with the United States. Intense back and forth migration over the last 50 years, which has had big impacts on the Dominican Republic, but also in the US as well. Anyway, more research on race and Blackness in those 2 countries, definitely. And after that, hard to say. I'll take other nominations, I'm happy to. And Oscar, on Black thinkers. And it's a pleasure to see Oscar. He's a product of the University of Pittsburgh and one of our most distinguished products. Wrote a fabulous book on Black peasants in the Amazon. You got to read it. Alejandro de la Fuente and I recently did that collected volume on Afro-Latin American Studies and Introduction. There is a spectacular essay in that volume by Frank Guridi and Juliette Hooker, precisely on Black social and political thought in Latin America. And that was a brutal essay for them to write because they did a first draft, which looked at maybe 3 or 4 thinkers. And Alejandro and I said, that's wonderful. That's really a good start. But come on, let's get serious. We're talking about a lot more people than that. You at least have to give some signposts to the full spread of Black and political thought over the last 2 centuries in the region. And to their immense credit, they took that suggestion/order and ran with it. And this essay really covers a lot of ground. Students can then go on from that essay to pursue any one of a number of directions, but that's a great starting point, I would argue. It's a little heavy reading. It's not for every undergraduate, but if somebody's interested in this topic, that's the place to begin.
I would echo the Dominican Republic, and I would add Puerto Rico. All again, its status makes it fairly unique in the region. I just think that there's work coming, but there's just hasn't been enough work done. And I would also say Central America, particularly in terms of the Garifuna and those communities, especially because they're increasingly transnational. I think those also need far more attention than they've been getting. And the names are escaping me at the moment, so I'll have to get back to you on some of the scholars I recommend.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We have another, I think, a question or a comment from Oyelda Martinez, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to listen to all of you. I've been reading your work for some time, and I'm extremely happy to have been invited. my concern, I'm following Dr. Andrews' comments, is that we need more work, or we need to publish more work on the thinking and writings of Black political thought and thinkers in Latin America, because my experience is that we come out of some of these courses very well understanding the contrast and the thinking behind Black political thought in the United States, but I'm not sure we can parallel it to the region of the hemispheric region. And a lot of us come out of our courses thinking that there were none, or there were very few, whereas there's centuries of thinking Black political thought that is reconfigured on their literature, reconfigured on their pamphlets, reconfigured on any other way. And I think that as a student of this field, I'd like to be able to, at some point, be able to look at both tracks and then be able to draw historical comparisons within historical contexts of both tracks. But I'm so sad that my colleagues in my classes cannot learn as much about our experience in Latin America in terms of Black thinkers.
Can I respond? I totally agree with you. The next step, after we got the essay from Frank and Juliet, they talk about this problem and the fact that all of this literature, 98% of it is not available in translation, and therefore not accessible to people in the United States, or to English readers in the United States. And it was, when they wrote that, we of course knew that, but a kind of light bulb went off when we read that passage in the essay. And that's where Paulina Alberto and I got the idea of starting to translate a selection of articles from the Black newspapers, because that's precisely where a lot of these thinkers published their work. And we have now translated a big selection of those articles. We were getting ready to send it in and have it published. And then we discovered that, whoops, there's a little thing called copyright law, for which we have to get the rights to publish a lot of these articles because their authors died before the statute of limitations runs out. And folks, you know, I'm now facing the situation where we may have the most beautiful manuscript you've ever seen, which will never see the light of day, because it's really hard to track down the heirs of these writers, many of whom published maybe one article, two articles, three articles. We don't know when they died. We don't know where they died. We don't know who their heirs are. And this is an issue which, you know, I mean, we'll work on it. And that's not to say I wish we hadn't done this. I'm very glad we've done it. I hope you get to read it someday. I'll write to you and let you know if it gets published and if it becomes available.
Please.
And I hope the rest of you will read it too. But it may never see the light of day. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens. But the main point is, you're so right. That work is out there. It's, you know, I won't say moldering in libraries, but it is definitely buried in libraries, and very few people get to see it. Very few people get to read it. Very few people get to talk about it.
But if I may add, even in Spanish, I think that
Okay.
I mean, it's only until recently with Lari that I got to read Colombian Afro thinkers, right? And then I'm wondering whether Chileans can read the Afro-Cuban thinkers. You know, it's sort of like, you know what? Even within the same hemisphere, we don't do this.
That is very true. For these newspapers, folks, we're working on papers from 4 countries, Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Uruguay.
Okay.
For 3 of those countries, these newspapers are totally available, digitized in their national libraries. You can go to the national libraries, look up the papers, write to me if you want a list of them, I'll give them to you. There are like 40 papers in Brazil, there may be 30 in Uruguay, there may be 10 in Argentina. Cuba hasn't gotten around to doing this yet, but maybe someday they will. And you can go and actually read these folks in the original. It's available, but for those countries.
Right.
I think we have time for maybe at least one more question, maybe two, from our audience, comments as well.
Hey, Sherwin, I totally missed that because I'm writing down something that somebody sent me. What? Say that again.
No. What I was simply saying was that we have a little bit more time for some more questions and comments. I see some comments coming up in the chat, and now I see a couple of hands have popped up. So Jordan Mulkey, one of the PhD students in African American Studies here, and then we'll follow that with Mary Patillo, Chair of the Department of African American Studies. So Jordan, please, and also Pablo after Professor Patillo. We'll go in that order, and that will probably run the time out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bryant and everyone. This conversation has been very generative. I have a question about how, well, I would just like the professors to think out loud about how Afro-Latin American studies conceives what they understand to be the kind of central consensus or theory around race or Blackness in the field, and how do they perceive its commentary on race at this present moment, if there is a kind of central theoretical approach to it at all. Yeah, I don't know if that's a helpful question.
I'm almost afraid to say what I think the central consensus is. It'll seem too obvious. The central consensus at the moment, I would argue, is that race is not biological. It's socially constructed. It's constructed in different ways at different moments, in different settings. And therefore, it's the work of us to try to zero in as researchers and writers on those moments, settings, and processes of racial construction to understand how that happened and with what kinds of effects, because race doesn't look the same in every place at every time. Then there's lots more to say about race, but I don't know if, Michele and Ted, what do you guys think? Is there more consensus ground out there beyond that? That's what I would see as the point or points that most people would agree on.
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I know that's how it's framed in all of the conversations with my colleagues in Cuba. Yeah, I would just concur with that.
Hey, I can think of one more thing. Despite the fact of being constructed and being an invention and a construction, it can be very, very durable, very, very strong, very, very long lasting. Again, you have to look at it in specific settings and see what's going on there in those various settings.
I would agree that that's consensus. The way I teach it, and I think this is probably true for most of my colleagues, at least here in Texas, is it goes back basically to Omi and Wynant's racial formation version of critical race theory. And that includes all the components that my two distinguished colleagues were talking about, but also is careful to talk about racial projects, which means that race, as has already been said, and racism in particular, varies from epoch to epoch, from place to place, et cetera, constructed, but also that it articulates discourse with practice in important kinds of ways and has structural expression.
Thank you so much for that. I want to move now. We have just about 5 minutes to directly to Pablo, based on Mary's comment in the chat. Thank you.
Well, I would respectfully ask Sherwin that you ask Pablo to show his face and ask that question, and then we'll deal with it. If he wants to be provocative, then all right, let's own it.
There it is. Pablo, what do you say?
So I apologize, my Wi-Fi is a little funky. What was that last part, Dr. Gordon?
I just said, ask the question.
You know, it's not, I don't know if it's a question. I mean, I think what's been really, you know, it's been an interesting conversation. I'm always learning from all of you, and I'm really grateful for it. But I also think, I just really honestly thought we were in a different moment, right? I really thought we were, in terms of the field of Afro-Latin American studies, I thought we were really at a point where disciplines were being dismantled, right? That interdisciplinarity was at the center of the work, because it's also the way Black folks have created knowledge production in the Americas, right? So like, I'm also constantly thinking about, you know, that corner of the African diaspora that gets left out consistently, right? Central America's Caribbean coast. And I think so much of what I would hope and want Afro-Latin American studies to be is to be a space of hemispheric engagement, right? To deeply think, not to just, you know, simply name Black Latinx folks who are in the US, but to really, you know, Schomburg developed this entire genealogy and legacy, right? That, you know, Garifuna folks, Black Central Americans, Black folks in Latin America build on and thrive on. And it was interesting to kind of hear that the disciplines are still in kind of this institutional power, right? And like, even this moment in my own career, very early on, thinking about where does the book project on Garifuna, New York really fit? And it doesn't really fit in Afro-Latin American studies, right? It's not a space where we're also thinking about what's happening with those communities in the US, right? That even though there is a sentence, and I think there is kind of a transnational lens, right, to think about, but it also makes me think about the political elites that form the field too, right, of Latin American studies, right? And like all of these names and all of these thinkers, well, there were certain political intellectual capital that they came from and continue to have in the field. So I guess it's not really a question, but just more kind of a wondering, when is that moment going to happen for Afro-Latin American studies? And to think about, you know, what does it mean to not think about Gilberto Freire, right? But to think about Nascimento and like think about Black thinkers in the region who don't necessarily have the institutional or political elite power as their counterparts, right?
So I want to invite responses to our panelists, and I'm also specifically thinking about, you know, what Pablo just said in terms of his work not fitting in terms of Afro-Latin American studies. This might be an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we mean by Afro-Latino studies, Afro-Latinx studies. What does it mean to do the particular kind of hemispheric work that, you know, that Pablo's calling us out on? Please, any of the panelists, I'm looking at you, Michele, given your interventions on Afro-Latinx studies of late, and the really generative conference that I recall you having at Pitt just a few years ago around this very kind of concern, right?
Yeah, to Pablo's point, I mean, so the disciplines aren't going anywhere, which makes it, you know, complicated for someone who's working on the kind of work that you're doing. But I think, you know, as I'm always pushing the transnational piece of it is really critical, especially the more populations that are migrating, the circular migration. So we have to continue to think about that. I'm hopeful that there's a series coming up that will be able, that yours would fit perfectly into, but we could talk about that later. but no, I mean, I think part of the issue is continuing to have the conversations, continuing to have the scholars who are doing Afro-Latin American studies. And again, it's multidisciplinary. So that's part of the issue, that it's not going to be in just one place. And I don't think we want it in just one place. We want it in all the places if we can get it there. But I think also thinking about the field of the kind of emergent field of Afro-Latinx studies, which again, trying to pull it apart a little bit from Latino studies, trying to make sure it's holding on to what's going on in Afro-Latin American studies. That requires a lot more effort. The scholars have to continue talking. We have to remind ourselves about these intersecting spaces, just thinking about all of the transnational kinds of issues that we have to contend with, that should be spaces for collaborative kinds of work. So whether it's policing or migration, health disparities. I mean, there's a whole host of things that we should be addressing as scholars. But you're right. If you're looking for one discipline, one space for it, that's not what we have in the academy. But I think the beauty of that is that there are people coming from multiple spaces, and that can coalesce into this to maintaining the Afro-Latin American studies and Afro-Latinx studies, creating bridges to bring them together, so that to maintain the vibrancy that Reid mentioned earlier, the innovation. We need to keep pushing for that. So I'd say embrace the multiplicity of it all. I mean, I know it's not easy because of the way that the structures are set up, but that's, we can break down some of these elements and create new ones in their place. But I think the structures are here to stay. So we have to figure out ways to work. I mean, as we have always done, working around, through, between, creating a space where there was none.
Yeah.
So thank you for your comment.
I guess I agree with that. I'm not sure myself what Afro-Latino studies is. I think that I've thought about it as some kind of subset of Latin American studies, and I don't do Latin American studies. I do diaspora studies. I do Black studies. I guess I do Africana studies. The kind of national, if we're talking about area studies, the national kind of references that come along with Latin American studies and Afro-Latino studies and all that is a little too much for me, especially since Blackness, from my perspective, at its utopian best, is transnational. And so, I got myself in trouble in anthropology with this also, is kind of thinking about Blackness as a transnational community was a little too much, pursuing sameness rather than difference, although I don't think that's what I was doing. So, your work certainly fits into my understanding of what diaspora studies is, and what my understanding of Africana studies is, and my understanding of Black queer studies, and, all of that. And the fact that you don't find a place in Afro-Latino studies is, I don't know what it is. But maybe that's because I'm in Texas and, other folks are elsewhere. So anyway, that's my response to that.
I'm going to engage in one last shameless act of product placement. That volume, Afro-Latin American Studies and Introduction, has a terrific essay by for people asking the question, what is Afro-Latinx studies? Has a great essay by Jennifer Jones on precisely that question. And Pablo, I can't remember if Garifuna are mentioned in that essay or not. I kind of think they're not. I'd have to go back and look. Anyway, just to put that on the table.
With that, Sherwin, Kristina and I, LACS here at Northwestern, Andean Cultures and Histories, we want to thank our guests, Edmund Gordon, Michele Reid-Vazquez, and Reid Andrews, and our audience for this phenomenal exchange, for these doubts, for this probing, for making us think, especially about institutionality, because let's face it, we're all institutionalized in good and bad ways, right? And it's very worthwhile to think about it in the terms of the sorts of work that we do and that we hope to do. So thank you for that. I also want to thank our staff again, Cindy Pingree, Danny Postal, and all the staff at LACS, without whom we wouldn't be able to do any of this work. And I want to encourage all of you to return to the Afro-Latin American series. We have yet a number more of talks. And finally, I want to ask you to join me in thanking our three panelists for their interventions here today and their presence.